The world saw him as the voice of a new Germany, the Führer of a nation rising from the ashes. But behind the closed doors of his home, the most powerful man in Europe was a prisoner of his own obsession, a quiet, suffocating love for his own niece that would become the most devastating tragedy of his private life. Her name was Geli Raubal. To many, she was just a young woman with bright eyes, quick laughter, and dreams of her own. But to Adolf Hitler, she was something more, something he could never fully name, nor ever let go of. Their relationship was cloaked in secrecy, bound by blood, power, and a forbidden intimacy that defied both morality and convention. This is the story of a love that could not exist, of a woman trapped in the orbit of a man who would change history, and of a tragedy that revealed the shadows lurking inside the dictator's heart. Before the war, before the empire, before the world knew his name in terror, there was Geli, and the secret that haunted him until the end.
The world knew Adolf Hitler as the Führer, the man who promised to restore Germany's pride, the leader whose voice thundered across mass rallies. To his followers, he embodied discipline, self-control, and sacrifice. He projected the image of a man too consumed by destiny to be distracted by earthly attachments. But in the quiet streets of Munich, far from the floodlit parades and the orchestrated propaganda, another story was unfolding. One that few dared to whisper aloud. For behind the iron facade of the dictator was a secret that threatened to unravel the myth he so carefully constructed. Her name was Angela Maria Geli Raubal. Born in 1908, she was 23 years younger than Hitler, his half-niece, the daughter of his half-sister. Where he was brooding, she was radiant. Where his life was rigidly scripted, hers was just beginning. She was charming, full of vitality, and possessed a restless spirit that longed for freedom. But fate tethered her to a man who was not simply her guardian, not merely her uncle. Adolf Hitler placed her at the center of his private universe. She moved into his Munich apartment in 1929, at a time when his political star was beginning to rise. On the surface, it was a gesture of care, a benevolent uncle offering his niece stability. In reality, it marked the beginning of a suffocating control that blurred every boundary. Hitler, who spoke to millions about sacrifice and purity, lived a double life. He was a man incapable of sharing power, even in love. With Geli, his affection became obsession. His protectiveness became possession. And his desire to keep her close spiraled into a relationship that was both scandalous and forbidden. The whispers began within his inner circle. Whispers of jealousy, of arguments, of a bond that defied convention. To the world, Hitler maintained the illusion of celibacy, a man too dedicated to the cause of Germany to indulge in romance. But those who saw Geli at his side recognized something deeper. Something dangerous. Geli's life inside Hitler's apartment was gilded, but it was not free. She wore fine clothes, attended gatherings, and lived in comfort, but she also lived under constant surveillance. Friends would later recall her restlessness, her desire to break away, her dream of studying singing in Vienna. She wanted a life of her own. But Hitler's control left no room for independence. And then, in September 1931, tragedy struck. Geli Raubal was found dead in Hitler's apartment with a gunshot wound to the chest. She was only 23. The official verdict was suicide. But rumors of scandal and abuse spread like wildfire. Some whispered that she had been murdered. Others believed she had simply chosen death over captivity. What is certain is that Geli's death devastated Hitler. For weeks, he vanished from public life, drowning in grief. Friends later claimed it was the darkest period of his existence. And yet, like so many shadows in Hitler's private world, the truth was buried, obscured, left for history to speculate. This is not merely the story of a dictator's private scandal. It is the story of a young woman whose life was consumed by one man's obsession. A forbidden relationship that exposed Hitler's deepest vulnerability, and revealed how even his most intimate desires were shaped by power, control, and tragedy. The shadow of Geli Raubal never left him. She was the ghost he carried into every future relationship, the silent wound behind the mask of the Führer. To understand Hitler not only as a dictator but as a man, we must begin here, in the private darkness he fought to keep hidden from the world. Angela Maria Geli Raubal was born in Linz, Austria, in 1908. From the beginning, she grew up in a household touched by the larger family name of Hitler, though she could not have imagined how it would define her fate. Geli was bright, inquisitive, and like many young women of her time, she dreamed of independence, dreams of study, of travel, of a life beyond the confines of domestic expectations. Her mother, Angela, was Adolf Hitler's half-sister. By the mid-1920s, Angela was drawn into her brother's growing political machine, working as his housekeeper at the Obersalzberg retreat and later in Munich. And so, by the end of the decade, Geli found herself living not only under the same roof as her uncle, but under his gaze. In 1929, Hitler invited Geli to move into his apartment on Prinzregentenplatz in Munich. She was 21. He was 39. To outsiders, it seemed a gesture of kindness, a prominent man offering guidance to his niece. But those who knew the rhythms of the apartment soon recognized that this was no ordinary guardianship. Munich at that time was the heart of Hitler's political rise. The wounds of the failed beer hall putsch were still fresh, but his power was consolidating. Crowds swelled at his rallies. The Nazi Party was gaining traction. And as his public persona hardened into that of a national savior, his private life closed in around Geli. Inside the apartment, their relationship unfolded in ways that unsettled those around them. Geli, with her youthful energy and charisma, became a stark contrast to Hitler's theatrical rigidity. She teased him, laughed in ways others could not, and brought a vitality into his private life that even his closest aides noticed. For a man who demanded discipline and control from everyone around him, Geli represented something disarming, even dangerous, a touch of warmth that pierced through his carefully crafted armor. But this dynamic was not balanced. Hitler's fascination with her quickly turned into an all-consuming protectiveness. He insisted on overseeing her daily life, dictating who she could see, what she could study, and how she would spend her time. For Geli, the luxurious apartment on Prinzregentenplatz became a gilded cage. Accounts from those close to the couple suggest that Geli was restless. She longed for independence, often speaking of her desire to study singing in Vienna. She wanted her own career, her own future. Yet Hitler's growing obsession meant that every attempt at autonomy was met with resistance. He monitored her outings, restricted her travel, and bristled at the thought of her spending time with other men. The imbalance of power was undeniable. Hitler was already on the cusp of becoming one of the most influential men in Germany, while Geli was barely entering adulthood. Their age difference, nearly 2 decades, underscored the unequal footing of their relationship. What Hitler saw as care, guidance, and protection, others interpreted as control, possession, even entrapment. Within Hitler's inner circle, whispers began to circulate. Some suspected that his attachment to Geli was not merely familial. To them, it seemed too intense, too possessive, too close. In a society still bound by conservative values, the idea of an uncle obsessively shadowing his niece carried an air of scandal. Yet few dared to confront Hitler directly. The man who spoke of purity and discipline in public appeared to be living in contradiction in private. And so, Geli's life unfolded in tension. On one hand, she enjoyed the privileges of proximity to Hitler, fine clothes, social gatherings, and the trappings of wealth that few her age could access. On the other, she lived under the unrelenting eye of a man who demanded absolute obedience. She was adored, yet imprisoned. Cherished, yet suffocated. As Hitler's political star rose in Munich, Geli's personal freedom dimmed. She was no longer simply a niece. She was the centerpiece of his private life, the woman he could not let go of, even as the world prepared to hand him power. But this fragile arrangement could not last. Geli Raubal's youth and vitality clashed with the suffocating grip of her uncle's control. And the tension between them, like a silent storm gathering strength, would soon reach its breaking point. By 1930, the dynamic inside the apartment on Prinzregentenplatz had shifted. What began as a guardianship had grown into something darker, an obsession that shaped every hour of Geli Raubal's life. Hitler's political world was expanding rapidly. He was now not just a fringe agitator but a rising figure in national politics, his speeches carried in the press, his party gaining momentum. Yet, even as he tried to control the destiny of a nation, he was consumed by controlling the movements of one young woman. Geli lived under rules few could endure. She was forbidden from traveling without his permission. Even short trips were subject to his scrutiny. He dictated who she could speak to, where she could go, what she could study. When she expressed interest in studying voice in Vienna, her greatest ambition, Hitler refused. When she tried to pursue friendships or romance, he intervened, often violently. Eyewitness accounts from Hitler's circle describe an atmosphere of suffocation. Geli was shadowed constantly, her freedom reduced to the confines of his demands. His jealousy was notorious. If she so much as showed interest in another man, Hitler erupted in rage. Even those closest to him, his drivers, aides, and fellow party members, became targets of suspicion if they were seen speaking to her too warmly. The walls of the Munich apartment became a prison. Friends remembered Geli's laughter, her quick wit, but also her despair. She confided to some that she longed to escape, to breathe free air again. She dreamed of Vienna, of music, of independence. But each time she tried to carve a path for herself, she was pulled back into the orbit of her uncle's obsession. Within Hitler's inner circle, whispers grew. His relationship with Geli was never openly named, but it was impossible to ignore. The intensity with which he watched her, the way he spoke of her, the authority he exercised over her life, it blurred the line between uncle and guardian, between affection and possession. To some, it looked like devotion. To others, something forbidden, scandalous, and deeply unsettling. The imbalance of power could not be overstated. Hitler was a man on the verge of reshaping Germany, commanding the loyalty of thousands. Geli was a young woman barely past adolescence, tethered to him by family ties and trapped by his authority. Theirs was not a partnership, it was captivity. For Hitler, Geli was more than just company. She was an anchor, a figure who softened the edges of his otherwise rigid, theatrical persona. She was, in many ways, the only person who could tease him, laugh at him, disarm him. But for Geli, the same intimacy that gave her uncle moments of warmth brought her nothing but despair. She was adored, but not free. Protected, but never trusted. In Hitler's hands, love became control. Obsession became possession. And the whispers of a forbidden bond, never spoken aloud in public, began to follow them like a shadow. It was a shadow that would not only consume Geli's future, but also reveal the deepest crack in Hitler's carefully constructed facade, that beneath the mask of discipline and purity, he was a man ruled by desires he could neither admit nor relinquish. The stage was set for tragedy. And as the tension between obsession and independence grew unbearable, Geli Raubal's life hurtled toward its breaking point. September 18, 1931. The silence of Munich was broken by the sound of a single gunshot. Inside Adolf Hitler's lavish apartment on Prinzregentenplatz, 23-year-old Geli Raubal lay lifeless. The bullet had pierced her chest. The weapon was Hitler's own pistol. The official report came quickly: suicide. The verdict was stamped, the narrative sealed. But almost immediately, questions rose, questions that would never be answered with certainty. Geli's death was not merely another tragedy in Germany's turbulent interwar years. It was explosive. She was not just a young woman. She was Adolf Hitler's niece, the center of his private world. And her sudden, violent end sent shockwaves through both his household and the political movement that was on the verge of seizing national power. What exactly happened in those final hours remains a mystery. Witnesses recalled tension between Geli and Hitler in the days leading up to her death. She had expressed her desperation to leave, to escape to Vienna and pursue her dreams of singing. Rumors spread that she had grown close to other men, including Hitler's driver. To Hitler, such independence was unthinkable. Arguments erupted. His control was slipping, and with it, the fragile order of their hidden relationship. That September, Hitler left for a party conference in Nuremberg. Geli remained in Munich. By the time he returned, she was gone, her life ended by a single bullet. The scandal was immediate. Newspapers seized on the story. Political enemies whispered of murder. Allies scrambled to protect Hitler's reputation. The Nazi Party insisted on suicide, portraying it as the impulsive act of a young woman in despair. But many in Munich doubted the simplicity of that explanation. The rumors multiplied. That she had been trying to escape. That she had threatened to expose the truth of their relationship. That she had endured years of suffocating control. That the final confrontation with Hitler had pushed her to the edge. Even those close to Hitler did not deny the depth of his devastation. Upon hearing the news, he was inconsolable. For days, he withdrew from public life, hiding in seclusion. Associates described him as shattered, a man consumed by grief. Some later claimed this was the only time Hitler came close to breaking. And yet, grief did not erase suspicion. Some believed the Nazi machine orchestrated a cover-up, ensuring that the details of Geli's death remained obscured. The official story was polished, but behind closed doors, the whispers persisted, that her death was not a simple act of despair, but the tragic endpoint of a forbidden, toxic bond. At Geli's funeral, Hitler played the role of grieving guardian, laying wreaths and speaking of her as though she were the light of his life. But in private, he collapsed into despair. He kept her room untouched, her belongings preserved. He carried her photograph with him. To some, he referred to her as his only true love. To others, he spoke of her as a wound that would never heal. The truth of Geli Raubal's death may never be known. Whether suicide born of despair, or something darker, her end revealed what had been hidden from the world. That Adolf Hitler, the man who claimed to embody discipline and purity, was entangled in a relationship that was both taboo and destructive. Her death marked a turning point. In public, Hitler redoubled his efforts to craft the image of a man devoted only to Germany. In private, he never let her go. Geli had been the one person who pierced through his facade, and in losing her, he lost not only a niece, but the only figure who held sway over his heart. September 1931 left more than a body in Munich. It left a ghost, a haunting presence that would follow Adolf Hitler for the rest of his life. Geli Raubal's death in 1931 did not fade with the passing of time. It lingered, unseen but unshakable, like a shadow over Adolf Hitler's private life. For all his public bravado, for all the millions who later saluted him as Führer, the memory of Geli haunted him in ways that few would ever know. Her room in the Munich apartment remained untouched, preserved as though she might walk back in at any moment. Her portrait hung in his residences, her photographs tucked into his belongings. Visitors recalled seeing images of her kept in frames, carefully positioned where only his most trusted inner circle might notice. She was gone, yet she was everywhere, a ghost that lived in his private spaces. Some who knew Hitler best later said that he considered Geli his one true love. In hushed recollections, they described his grief as something unlike anything else they witnessed in his life. Political setbacks angered him, betrayals enraged him, but Geli's absence left him hollow. And yet, even in death, his obsession remained a secret bound in silence. Publicly, Hitler could never acknowledge the full truth of his bond with her. To the world, he presented the image of a man wedded only to his cause, too pure, too disciplined for romance. To admit otherwise was to risk exposing the scandal that could shatter the myth he had built. But privately, her loss left a scar that altered him. Those who encountered him in the years after her death often noted a colder, more detached figure. Where Geli once brought moments of laughter, of disarmament, there was now only rigid control. It was as though the warmth she brought into his life had been buried with her. And it shaped how he approached love afterward. Geli had been young, independent, spirited, and in the end, uncontainable. Hitler could not allow himself to be vulnerable like that again. He would never again risk a woman who might defy him, who might seek freedom, who might expose his contradictions. The ghost of Geli Raubal thus became more than a memory. She became a warning. A reminder that intimacy carried risk, that affection could spiral beyond control, that love itself could unravel the discipline he demanded of himself and others. Even in the most private moments, when Hitler retreated from the world, she was there. In his grief, in his silence, in the empty spaces that no speeches or parades could fill. Geli Raubal had become the forbidden figure at the heart of his life, a tragedy that no conquest, no empire, could erase. For Adolf Hitler, the dictator who demanded absolute obedience from a nation, there remained one truth he could never escape: the only person who had ever pierced through the mask of the Führer was the young woman he could not control, and whose death would haunt him until the end. In the years after Geli Raubal's death, Adolf Hitler withdrew further into secrecy. To the world, he cultivated the image of a man married only to Germany, a leader too consumed by destiny to surrender to private passion. But behind closed doors, another young woman entered his life, a woman who would never replace Geli, but who would occupy the space she left behind.